Okay, welcome to Coffee with Kyle. This is our podcast discussing issues in business and economics. I'm Kyle Murray, Dean of the Lazaridis School of Business and Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. My guest today is Nikolai Cook. Nick is an assistant professor in economics at the Lazaridis School. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Ottawa and did undergrad and master's work at York University. He was recently honored by the Government of Ontario with a very prestigious Pellany Prize, and it's only given to 5 researchers every year who are making significant contributions in Nobel Prize areas of chemistry, economic science, literature, physics, and medicine. Nick's work focuses on 2 important and really fascinating areas that we'll talk about today: environmental economics and research credibility. So, welcome, Nick. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Great to be here.
So this is our only podcast of the summer where we're taking it a little bit easier and a little bit more casual around the school. But I've been looking forward to this opportunity to talk research. And yeah, I've got my coffee here, my Lazaridis mug, and you have the Laurier mug. That's great. And let's pour into it. So first up, I just want to say that I'm a little bit biased in my enthusiasm for your work. I've also spent my research career anyway before administration in similar topics and areas. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that for sure. But first, maybe tell us a bit about the Pellany Prize and the work that led to that award.
So as you already mentioned, the Pellany Prize is awarded to a couple of young researchers. You have to be a certain number of years out from your PhD or less, and it is in those categories. Honestly, it was an application which felt very much like a tenure application. You put together what you've done kind of scholarly wise, what sets you apart, what kind of impact these things might have, or the things that your research might have. And it's kind of like a grant application. You do it in hopes that everyone wants it, right? Everyone hopes that they're going to get it. Put it in. It was a couple months later, I get a phone call at my desk. I was just coming back from one of the lectures, and just get a phone call that says like unknown number, which most of the time nowadays we don't usually answer, but just had a sort of feeling. Answered it, and they said, "Is this Nikolai Cook? And we'd like to let you know that you were selected." And there's this kind of like pause moment where you go, "Oh, that actually happened." So the gentleman Chris, when he was having that conversation with me, he waited that pause out, and he says that pause is very normal, in the fact that most people just need a second or two to process it. And then we walked through a couple of logistics that he said, again, we're going to send these logistics in an email because these are conversations people don't usually remember, and that is exactly the case. That's all I sort of remember. But the prize itself is it's meant to be recognition of high impact kind of work that hopefully betters Ontario. So the idea is that both sides of the research were kind of noticed by the selection committee, both the environmental economics, because I look at productivity. So the idea is how things in the environment are affecting how well people work. And the other side is about how can we read research, or how can we kind of address the problems that seem to be percolating in research or in the research community lately, especially in social sciences, of which economics is one. So
Yeah, we'll get into that second part for sure because it's both very interesting and timely, and also a little bit disappointing for those of us who are in the social sciences and been working in this area for a while. Um, I mean, I imagine that conversation is a little bit like the Nobel Prize conversation, where you do all this work, you've accomplished and published all this research, and then you get this call, and it's yeah, like you said, kind of surprising, a little bit overwhelming initially. Um, I remember talking to well, actually seeing the CV of a Nobel Prize winner in economics at one point. I won't mention who it is, but it was funny because, he's just listing all the awards in his career, and one of them was a Nobel Prize. It's like while it's a really big deal, like the Pellany Prize, it's also just kind of something you get for work you've already done. It's another type of recognition. So congratulations on that. That's really a big deal.
thank you so much. And you touched upon a really on a point there. Part of it is the intrinsic motivation. I just like doing research. It wasn't None of the research is done with the idea of a prize or a grant in mind. I just want to keep learning, right? Digging through the data, seeing what we can actually learn from what we know.
Yeah, and I think that's true of all, good, great researchers that if you do it as a job, if it's like a 9 to 5, then it's a grind. It's not that fun. People don't really enjoy their careers, but when you do it because you really enjoy the study and investigation and learning about the problems and finding something new or whatever it might be, that curiosity, satisfaction. If you do it for those reasons, then you tend to really enjoy your career.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes people say being a professor is a calling, and I think that gets more and more true over time for myself, at least, because I just can't turn it off. I look outside and I see air pollution, and I'm like, okay, how do I change my day to day? How do I go for a walk with my wife this morning in a way that we're not gonna, dose ourselves with the air pollution that's currently outside? And I'm like, oh, I wonder if this could go into a research project. A couple different facets are going into that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought one of the advantages of moving from Edmonton to Waterloo was I'd get away from the smoke in the summer a little bit. But apparently, it's the firefighters are still blowing smoke in this direction. So let's talk a little bit more about this sort of decision because to become a professor, because when you get a PhD in economics, like many of the PhDs in business as well, you do have other options. For being a professor isn't the only option. There's other jobs out there for you. Many, at least some of which are more lucrative, maybe
Mhm.
most of which are more lucrative. So why did you choose this career? And what I mean, you kind of talked about it, but what gets you excited about it?
Good question. I'll give a little bit of my undergrad. So my undergrad was mathematics. It was a double major. That's back when double majors were getting really promoted. So it was double major in criminology and mathematics. Um, that eventually switched. Might get into that later, but eventually I graduated with the BA in mathematics, and that seemed to be the only kind of marketable skill. And this is during one of those economic downturns, not the most recent one, but a couple of them back. And the only thing that seemed to be getting me jobs was tutoring in mathematics. So the first day that I went to go tutor, um, there was this high school senior. He really didn't know kind of where to begin on like just term test is coming up next week. Absolutely zero ground covered. And I got him to about 50%, 60% of the way there. And I just saw that smile. That's all on his end. On for me, when I finished, I walked out of that house and I said, I can't believe I just got paid to do that. That was fun. So I kind of like leaned back and I said, okay, maybe this is something good, right? I was studying to be maybe an actuary at the time, thinking about that route. But I was like, that was fun. I would do that again, and I would do it again without getting paid. So then there was a bit of soul searching involved in how do I go about teaching? This is a period of time when the Ontario becoming a teacher, a secondary school teacher, or likewise, was actually quite difficult. Um, so I said, okay, I'll be a prof. So kind of just set on a very long journey to get a master's at that point, and then a PhD. And then during the PhD, a second kind of like bit of luck happened in that there's a turn in economics where you go from being a consumer of research and a consumer of your textbook to a producer of research when you start to having to paint your own paintings rather than studying the master's, let's say. And it turns out I was good at that. I liked thinking of new ideas. I liked thinking of things that we could execute and things that were feasible at the same time. And it just sort of worked out. In terms of what I was also thinking is, let's say this prof thing doesn't work out because it doesn't always work out. If you get a PhD, you don't always get a tenure track position. That's the goal thing that we're all kind of searching for when we're in those doctoral programs, speaking in averages, of course.
Yeah.
Um, it really gets you thinking, especially when you're coming through the University of Ottawa. You have a couple of options. You have things where you could be in a policy center, working for something like the Bank of Canada, for example, which was a very normal outcome if you go through the University of Ottawa because they're right next to each other. The cultures kind of intermingle. You do a couple of co-ops, etc. So there are, as you mentioned, a couple of different things, other things that you could do. Um, they don't have to be entire all-consuming lifestyles. You can indeed work 9 to 5, put it home, and then you can, go hiking. Um, and the pay can be much better, especially in industry, for example, as well. For me, I love both halves of my job, or I should say thirds. I love both halves of my job. The teaching, just like that first tutoring session, I love every moment that I'm down there because it's downstairs. Um, I don't mean in the trenches, though I suppose it could be mentioned that way. I love every moment that I'm down there because I'm bringing what I think is valuable thoughts and insights, and just working through these things that we call economics, right? These tools, these models, these facts. And at the same time, that's usually January to April, and then in May, everything switches to research mode, and it's just a whole nother lease on life. You get to like change gears and then go fast on that. It's super fun as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in academia, who, like I said, enjoy it, kind of describe it in a similar way. So that's wonderful for me to hear. I always said as a professor that, I even as a PhD student, I enjoyed research enough that I would do it as a hobby on evenings and weekends. And now as dean, I actually find that's how I do research. So it turns out it was true. But it's yeah, I agree. I think there's something really compelling about it. And one of the other interesting things you said that I don't think a lot of people realize is um, this kind of career is all consuming. I think from the outside, if you've been at a university as a student, you see professors come into the classroom and they teach maybe 3 hours a week, a couple of classes, and you think, well, that seems like a fairly easy gig. And I think you and I both sort of agree that it is a job that often doesn't feel like work because we enjoy it so much. But it's at the same time all consuming, and regularly academics who enjoy their work are working really long hours, and we can't stop thinking about, like you were saying, you see some air pollution from forest fires outside, and you start to think, how can I work that into my research? Can I have an impact on that? Can I do something to contribute to solving those problems? So yeah, very interesting stuff. So let me ask you, what's on your whiteboard behind you?
Whiteboard behind me. This is a student who just finished her paper. So at the very end of the master's program in economics, we have a project paper, or like an actual piece of original research. So what she was wanting to look at is the effect of renewable energy investments on local labor conditions, and whether or not these kinds of investments, which should presumably be generating jobs, do they actually do so? And in so doing, if we show that there are increases in jobs, it could be a great way to say, look, the cost benefit analysis that we're doing prior to realizing that there's positive labor market spillovers, maybe we can implement these projects, especially more on the margin, because there are these productivity, or rather, I should say, these extra employment opportunities. So what's going on here is, if we cite, for example, a renewable energy project, do we see an increase in, for example, the labor force participation rate, or do we see a decrease in the unemployment rate? Measuring two slightly different things and seeing if that is indeed the case. So the idea here was, we were looking at OLS. For the economists out there, just show me the OLS, show me that the results are there with the most basic tool. But underneath the hood, there's also the concept of an instrumental variable. And just trying not to get too technical, the idea is there are resources that were already cited there, and that should be somewhat uncorrelated with the decision to cite and other, or more importantly, other market factors. So the idea is to use the variation in that instrumental variable to figure out the probability of a site being actually cited there, a renewable energy site, and using that kind of variation to isolate the effect of the renewable energy site and not other labor market forces. The idea is, can we use something else to kind of help us parse through the noise in the data, is what the instrumental variable is supposed to do for us. And indeed, she found that even through OLS and IV, there seemed to be positive job market spillovers when it comes to renewable energy investments. Project was only hampered by the fact that she needed a longer time to do the project, or to do the next stage of the project, I should say, to get access to the confidential data that the SPAC can holds, and then kind of go from there. If she wants to do a PhD, I said, go for it. It's a great project, and yeah.
Interesting stuff. But yeah, it's great to hear too that, we're involving students in research. I mean, I came up through a psychology program. I knew a lot about psychology research. I honestly didn't really know that business schools did research at all. So it was much later that I realized it wasn't all applied, that they're, and even when it is applied, that it's very rigorous work, like you were just describing. I think this is a good time for us to segue and talk a bit more about your research. And we may get a little bit, as Paul Krugman sometimes calls it, wonkish here, and in the details, but I think it's worth spending some time talking about. I don't know which one you want to start with, the environmental economics or kind of the research credibility side. I'm happy to chat about either one.
I gotta say the same thing. It's actually kind of interesting, depending upon who I talk to and which conferences I go to. I talk about one or the other, so I gotta wear two hats usually all the time, whether or not the visor's forwards or backwards. So I'm happy to chat about either.
Okay, well, I mean, let's. I'm most interested in the research credibility side, so let's start with that. I mean, I've known researchers who have been caught up in scandals where they have faked data, made up data, in kind of a really extreme way. But then there's also, I think, the less extreme versions of damaging credibility by just making maybe small changes in your results, not huge changes, not making up the entire data set, but just, what's sometimes called p-hacking or sort of tweaking the statistical significance of a result to get the outcome that you predicted. So I know this is some of your work, so tell me a little bit about what it is you're doing and how you've approached this problem.
Okay. I'll try to parse those weeds out as you mentioned with the Krugman kind of disclaimer. So starting just from the base, statistical significance is the be all end all. It seems to be when it comes to wanting to publish. So statistical significance is whether or not the finding that you found is likely or unlikely to have been given to us by chance. The idea being that that 5% statistical significance threshold, for example, means that the p-value or the probability that an effect as big or larger, there is only a 5% chance that chance could have given this to you. The idea being that it's extremely unlikely that this is given to you for no reason other than chance. What has happened over the last umpteen years is that statistical significance becomes a quick way for researchers and those who evaluate them, especially in the publication process, to decide whether or not this research is robust. And indeed, that's not what it is a measure of. It's a measure of whether or not chance could have given you the result.
Right.
But what that means is that 5% statistical significance threshold has two stars attached to it. What I mean by that is when you want to write up a paper, ultimately you run regressions, for example, you write up a paper and you give those results typically have p less than 0.05 or two stars next to them. Those kinds of indications of statistical significance are ways for the authors to say to the reviewers, look, what I found is probably robust or is, statistically significant. The
And
work
so
that
I'll just jump in for a second to give a little bit of context. For a lot of researchers, results that hit that zero point zero 0.05 kind of level or less than 0.05, um, historically have made the difference between publishing a paper and not publishing a paper, right? And
that's
so
right.
when you're looking at getting tenure or promoted or having an impact in your field, that becomes that zero point zero 0.05 looms very large in behavioral and social science research.
Exceedingly so. And indeed, it is that, what's what I'm looking for? Incentive structure, where if you have p is equal to 0.06, you're probably not going to get published versus p 0.04, you probably will. There's a large incentive for anyone, I should say, to try to move that p-value over by doing very innocent things. Let's trim some outliers, for example. Let's focus on a slightly different hypothesis. Maybe we just need to collect more data. Maybe we're going to look at a subset only. All of these kinds of techniques can move that p-value a little bit over that threshold, with the idea that perhaps I'll get published better or at all. So that process has a name, publication bias. Typically refers to statistical significance. There's other things that can feed into publication bias, but that is, if that's present, if it's the case that just over and all these statistically significant effects are what's getting published, if that's the case, when you read or when you're a consumer of research, hey, I want to find out if air pollution affects my productivity, for example, you type in a Google Scholar and you look at the published research, of course you're going to find nothing but statistically significant results that say, yes, of course, air pollution affects. Oh, this is Google talking to me. It's listening to me talking about my research and trying to give me some results. In the age of AI, right? Okay. What was I? You'll find nothing but statistically significant results saying, of course, X affects Y. But the problem is that indeed the case underneath the hood in terms of science? Is that the case, or is it just the publication process saying, yes, it is? And even if it isn't just the publication process, are the effects the same size as the research suggests, or are they much smaller? Because those slightly insignificant papers, slightly statistically insignificant papers, just didn't get published. So this comes down to this kind of twin connection between you're doing research transparency work, and one of the main reasons you do research transparency work is because the people who use your research, what you want to do is you want to create confidence, or you want to restore confidence if it's been lost, for the people who are reading Google Scholar, who are reading your journal articles, and you want to say to them, when you read these papers, you're getting the full picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's so important, and yet it's, I mean, in any one paper alone, you're not really getting the full picture because we have, replications and all these large literatures that kind of give us that insight. But I think this sort of a problem that Google Scholar and the internet created that didn't used to exist is that all kinds of people can read and have access to these papers without often the necessary context to really understand the results. Because when I write a paper, I'm writing it for an academic audience, and most of my readers, that at least in my mind, as I'm writing and doing the research, most of my readers have that context and are embedded in that work, and so there's a lot of things that you don't say that you would say if you were writing for a general audience, that kind of thing. So yeah, very interesting. Please continue. I don't want to interrupt the stream.
No problem. So the first kind of project we worked on in that was there are certain tools that economists use. So economists we're social scientists, but we love our mathematics. We love our mathematical models. And one of the things that economists are often hampered by is we cannot run an experiment because it would oftentimes, for example, be unethical. So if I were to randomize people into getting health insurance, for example, you have to think about, perhaps we're leaving people actually suffering when we shouldn't be allowing them to suffer, for example. So what economists tend to have to do is we have to use data that is already pre-existing, and we need to be able to tease out causality from correlations. And we do that with a couple of different tools. Let's not get too much into the weeds, but there's four main ones. There is the randomized control trial, which is where you actually randomize. For example, this village gets deworming pills. This village does not. And you do your best. The reason you're doing it is because you want to show that these pills work. And then maybe afterwards, once you've proven that they work, an NGO can come in and apply them. Now that we know with proper research that these are very effective and in this setting. So that's the RCT. There's three more: DID, differences in differences, instrumental variables, which I already talked about a little bit, and regression discontinuity. There's others out there. These are the main ones that we kind of see in the what's called the credibility revolution, which is a couple of years back in coming. That first project evaluated publication bias by the methods, or those four methods. So what we did is we wanted to look at the differences in publication bias in the literature in economics, and we found there was quite big differences between how people, it's not the methods themselves, it's the questions and the researchers and how they're using those methods seems to differ by RCTs versus those other three. And we found that, for example, RCTs seem to have the least amount of publication bias, whereas regression discontinuity, and we hypothesized that the reason why regression discontinuity has very low publication bias is something like researcher degrees of freedom, i.e. the number of decisions that you make as you're writing a paper that uses RD, seems to be quite low as compared to, for example, differences in differences and instrumental variables. So it was a matter of comparing the tools of economics as we use this observational data rather than randomized experimental data.
Yeah, so as somebody who does a lot of, really most of my work has been randomized controlled studies or some kind of experiment where it's, mostly controlled, if not entirely controlled, and often even run in a lab in the early days before we use the internet a lot now, which is maybe not the same kind of control. Yeah, I mean, in my world, there have been some very high profile people at some of the top schools in the world who I think under the pressure to publish and the pressure to have impact have not just done some of the small things you mentioned where you might collect some more data or remove some outliers, but showing up in the lab on a Monday morning with a new data set for their graduate students to analyze that was entirely fictitious. And I know it's something that troubles me because we at least historically, I mean, I would like to think of us as being highly credible experts in a lot of these areas because of the rigor we bring to our work. And I think that the work you're doing is very important to try and, along with a lot of other people, but to try and bring back some of that credibility and put up some barriers or at least some guardrails around people who are maybe somewhat tempted or incented even to go off the path.
For sure. There are scandals in economics as well. I'll promote the Institute for Application here in the work that's being done there. In terms of finding out those sorts of things, I think one of the best revolutions that we've seen in the past, I would say 3 years, maybe a little bit less, is this open or publishing of data. So the fact that if you want to publish a paper in most top journals nowadays in economics, you have to publish the data that leads to those conclusions. There are some exceptions, of course, but typically you have to say, this is the data I used. Here's the code that runs the regressions of the statistical tests that are in the paper, and they have to go into a public repository. And it is my opinion that that is the best way that we have right now to stop those kinds of fraudulent cases, because the researcher who is perhaps performing those kinds of falsifications, let's say, or the falsifying of evidence, they have to publicly publish that data. And there are very smart people out there who are they're not downloading the data just to see if it's wrong.
Right.
They're downloading the data because, for example, they have a research idea that works with that data while they mix it with something else, like a different identification strategy. There was a lotto experiment once upon a time that I was interested in. I downloaded their application package because I was like, I wonder if people buy lottery tickets differently on when it's very hot out, right? Does that desperation kick in or something along those lines? Never followed up with that project, but feel free if you're listening and you're looking
Good
for
idea.
a
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean it's kind of aged out of mine in my program, so that's free to take if you want it. What was I saying? But people are downloading these things and they're going to check, does this data even make sense, right? Does the distribution of male versus female, like, does it make sense compared to what's in the paper? Does it say like, oh, we randomly selected, so we should get roughly 50-50? Or does it say we went to an all-girls school, so we should see 100% female students? Do the ages make sense? All of these sorts of things are going to get looked at by very, very smart people, PhD students, master's students, other researchers, other tenure track professors, for example. People are going to look at it, and the fact that you had to make it available means people are going to look at it, and if they find that there is if things are incongruent, then some questions will start to get raised, and these kinds of scandals can definitely come to light. But that's
Yeah.
only because there's a journal policy requiring you to publish the data.
Yeah, that's very important, especially in when data sets can't be replicated, right? When it's a data set that's kind of unique, got at an interesting problem, and if you can't have access to that data, you really can't check to see if anything funny happened, or even if a mistake was made. And
Hmm.
the other side, in kind of experimental work, replication is so important. I remember one of my favorite papers when I was an assistant professor. I brought it to my lab, and one of my students was interested, and a PhD student at that time wanted to kind of build on the work. And for a while, I thought, like, what is going on? Because he runs a study that they ran identically in the same paper, and couldn't get it to work. The results weren't significant. I started to even think maybe it was him just being in the lab that was the contaminant, right? Like we couldn't
Right.
figure it out. And then ultimately, as I talked to other people at conferences and things, I started to hear, oh yeah, we can't replicate that either. And it turned out that, yeah, this was a fairly famous paper that no one could replicate. And because we don't, at least historically, and still to a large extent, don't publish failed studies, the word
Mhm.
had not got out there that this is not something you could do. So now that we have these replication programs, people with access to the original data, I think it is starting to make a difference. So that's good news for social science research and for anyone who is interested in becoming a researcher in the social sciences.
I agree. Quick shout out to something like Economic Inquiry, which is a journal that put out a call for um, uh, replications and reproductions. And it was in economics, we don't usually publish those sorts of things. And this was an open call that there's going to be a special issue made up of these otherwise very unpopular types of manuscripts. So seeing that as an indicator for perhaps some of the tides are changing when it comes to replication and reproduction, especially because young researchers, they need those incentives, right? They can't spend 3, 4 months on a project that will not get published just because of norms in the profession versus other types of research, for example. So it's really heartening to see that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Okay, so that's sort of the most wonkish section of our podcast because, and you and I could probably talk about this for quite a while, but before we wrap up, I want to talk briefly about your work on environmental economics as well. But maybe as unwonkish as possible. So sort of the high level view of the work you're doing there.
We'll do my best. Okay, so for example, it's August 5th, and today we are in Ontario and we are breathing in uh, air pollution. Air, yeah, I know you say wonkish, but you're talking to you're talking to so I'll do my best, but there's a reason I bring it up.
That's all right.
So in that air pollution, there are particles, and those particles are very small. That's called PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5 microns across. The idea being that those are 20 or so, can fit across the width of a human hair. Reason I bring this up is two reasons. If you are breathing that in, it goes into your lungs through your alveoli, and it can actually pass the blood-brain barrier. So there will not necessarily only be somatic symptoms, you can also get psychological symptoms. And that's what I like to focus on, is whether or not it affects your thinking and how productive you are in terms of your mind. Those particles are so small indeed that they can actually pass through most building envelopes. So when you build a building, you try to build it up to certain standards, whether or not it can pass a certain vacuum test, for example. Retrofits usually use these kind of measures. How airtight is your house, for example? Older buildings correlate to having less tight of a building envelope, whereas a building like the Lazaridis School has a very good one. And indeed is constructed to LEED certification standards, which not necessarily are aimed at PM 2.5 protection, but nonetheless seem to have a little bit of help. Why do I bring all this up?
Little shout
Some
out
of
to the great building we're both working in today. But
Agreed. A little shout out to that. Always going to bring up the LEED certification program because it's all about energy efficiency and renewable materials. Okay, why do I bring these things up? Because air pollution, like you see today, can affect you. So there is very good research that shows asthma attacks go up, visits to the ER go up for respiratory distress. But some of the other research is all about the non-health effects of air pollution. And the work that I've done, for example, is using a database of student grades, for example. Shout out to my alma mater at the University of Ottawa. They gave me access to the student grades. And I looked at whether or not a high pollution day reduced the test grades. And you want to do the best you can on your final exams. Whole reason you go to you bunker down and you study and you do your best. Your exam is scheduled a particular day. You wake up, it's a high pollution day. You write your exam, your scores are a lot lower than they otherwise would have been. What's interesting, you know, that's not great. And it gives an idea as to the perhaps undocumented costs of air pollution, because nobody's saying, okay, this air pollution is going to cause people to be less productive. They're saying the air pollution is going to cause us more ER visits. Yes, those ER visits are of primary concern, but if everybody's productivity drops by 1%, that's a lot lost. So the idea is you do worse. Why do I bring up the building envelope? Because you can't really hide from it all that well. What I did find is that if you are it's Ottawa. There's not a whole lot of like heavy industry to speak of. So all the air pollution that's there really comes from automobiles, which means it's all on the ground level. What you can do is you can be a little bit further away from that point source and reduce the effect of air pollution on you. So for example, if your exam room was on a much upper floor as compared, the effect you had from that air pollution is a lot lower.
Hmm.
So these
Wow,
kind of like
that's fascinating. So, and you did a great job of not making it too wonkish at all. A little bit of a, a part of the reason that when we talk about these things between academics or, talk about this kind of work is it gets a little wonkish is because of the rigor that goes into it. And
mhm.
sometimes that does make it hard to explain it to a general audience without getting into the technical side too much, because we have such a high standard for rigor. So. Okay, so one of the areas you're interested in is air pollution, and you actually did find that there was an effect on test scores.
That's right, exactly. So we did find a somatic effect on that, and sorry, a psychological effect on that. And what became interesting is after that project was kind of wrapped up, we looked at each other and we thought, what if we pushed the boundaries to physical protection? Let's say you weren't actually breathing it in at all, but you could see that there was air pollution or there was some sort of distress coming from the fact that if you look outside, there's wildfire smoke and there's some sort of pollution. You mentioned earlier when we started going to the lab to do these kinds of like experiments to see
Yeah.
whether or not something, some sort of treatment and control comparison can be made. So one of the follow-up experiments was what we call pollution pictures. And the idea is even if you're not breathing in the air pollution, if you are engaging with the thought that, look at this is, please pretend that this is your outside world. Talk to me about that outside world. What do you see in that outside world? And the treatment group was seeing pollution, and the control group was seeing the exact same city scenes without pollution. Blue sky, people walking around, greenery, whereas everything else was just like we see outside today, muted in color and a little bit more obscure. And we found that despite the fact that we said we'll pay you for every question you get right, or we'll pay you for every math calculation that you get right, the best performers and on average, the people who were thinking about air pollution weren't doing as well. They were doing about 10% less well for that period of time that we were measuring them than the people who had a beautiful day given to them. So we extrapolate from that to say that even the thought of air pollution seems to reduce people's performance, at least in the short term. And the reason I bring that up is because we used 2,000 mechanical turkers that were not necessarily representative of the United States population, but they were well represented across all of the continental US, giving us quite a little bit of statistical power, but also a lot of variation on whether or not you are breathing in air pollution or not. And that was seemingly uncorrelated with the treatment group, which is why we run randomization in the first place.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating work. Okay, so I think we're just about out of time. One of the great things we talked about earlier, maybe one of the downsides of all this work being available is some misinterpretation. One of the great things about it is people can go to Google Scholar and your website and other places and read more about this work. So that's wonderful. It's also really great to have people like you, Nick, working on these important problems. And congratulations again for having that work recognized with the Polanyi Prize. That's exciting for the whole school and really the province to see we're tackling some of these important issues right here at the Lazaridis School.
Thank you.
And
Speechless.
well, and it's really really great to talk with you today. I could go on and on, so I've had to kind of limit my questions that I have about this interesting work. You and I will probably get a chance to talk again. Maybe we'll do it again as a podcast. And I hope everyone who tunes in gets something out of the interesting things we've talked about today. So thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.